What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you part 5 of our story of Pathfinder Kingmaker series. And last we left off, we had just finished off Vortikai. As I mentioned at the end of our part 4 video, the next part of the story starts immediately upon returning to your capital, which is unusual because normally you play out what's left of the timer on the Ancient Curse. The exception to that is Chapter 5. Now, before we get into it, I do want to make one slight addendum to my last video that I forgot to mention. When Tristan is either with you or teleports into the room where Vortikai is, if you have done some very specific things, it is possible to make him destroy the Oculus of Abaddon instead of stealing it, but he does still leave at that point. That is important for reasons we're about to get into. Once you leave Vortikai's tomb, head back to your capital. The next chapter starts, which is kicked off by Castle, I cannot pronounce these people's names. But regardless, he will tell you that Jamandi has sent us a missive saying that the Numerian barbarians are marching on Restov, and she needs help immediately to head off their advance. You also, simultaneously, get word that something is going on at Lake Candlemere with the Bloom, which is a solid lead for where Tristan might have ran off to. And you are told to go track one of these leads down. So here's the thing. These two things are exclusive to each other, time-wise, meaning doing one first changes the other one. So because of that, for this part of the story, I actually kind of have to explain these choices, because what happens in Vortikai's tomb, as well as this follow-up chapter, has huge implications on the end of the game. So we're going to run through basically what doing each one first tells you. If we go to Lake Candlemere and investigate what happens with Tristan first, we will get to talk to him when we go to Lake Candlemere. We won't learn much. Essentially, we'll just learn that he's actually a deva who has fallen from grace from Sarenrae, his goddess, who he quite literally served, not just as a cleric, but like as one of her hands, so to speak. At which point he will run off, and we will have to chase him, and we will catch a vision through the portal he runs through of a temple with a stag head, otherwise known as the Temple of the Elk, which is where we have to follow up. At the Temple of the Elk, we will be able to enter the first world, run through a bit of a dungeon where we can find Tristan and Nerissa. So after this dungeon, you'll come to Tristan and Nerissa. So it turns out, as we'll learn from this conversation, that the Guardian of the Bloom that has been hounding us and causing our barony all this trouble, her name is actually Nerissa. It turns out that she managed to lie to and corrupt, in a way, Tristan. The details on that are a little vague, but essentially she lied to him and convinced him that she had cut him off from his goddess and somehow turned him into a mortal being as opposed to a deva. And she used that leverage to convince Tristan to do things for her, such as help her plant the ever-blooming flower from Chapter 3 in 2 worlds simultaneously. That's how it was growing in the first world, as well as Galerion, which is the Pathfinder world. So basically, Tristan has been her spy this whole time. Now, the more important thing, because we learn this information pretty much regardless of when we come to this part of the quest, however, what we do learn extra if we come here first is that the reason Tristan stole the Oculus of Abaddon from Vortikai was so he could give it to Nerissa, who could use it to find hidden things, which is like the main thing that the Oculus of Abaddon does. It reveals hidden things. And while we don't know it just yet, she is looking for something very specific. The only way to keep her from finding it herself, which I will actually get into in the next part of this series, but for now, just know that the only way to keep her from getting it herself is to have done these specific things to make Tristan destroy the Oculus instead of stealing it. It does not ruin anything. If Tristan does steal the artifact instead of destroying it, you can still complete the secret ending, which is like the true ending as it tends to be called. But suffice to say, if Nerissa gets her hands on the Oculus of Abaddon, that ending becomes more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. So ideally, you want to have Tristan destroy the artifact, but it's not a huge deal if he doesn't. It just makes something that we'll get into a little later more difficult that I'll cover more in the next chapter. Because it's not revealed here, so I don't want to reveal it in full. But just know that if we come here first, we get all this information about who Nerissa actually is, and that she had the Oculus of Abaddon found because she wants it to use it to find something very specific that has been hidden from her. Now, at this point, we can deal with Tristan, regardless of when we came here, and we can kind of, decide what we want to do with him. You can kill him. The best thing to do is spare him, which I highly recommend you do because he is the best counselor in the game, and chances are, depending on your actions, he might be your only option as the counselor, which is a kingdom management thing. So if you kill Tristan, there's a very real possibility of you leaving yourself without an advisor for a position, which needless to say is absolutely crippling in terms of kingdom management. Now, the only other thing that we learn if we come here first and speak to Nerissa is that she is the person who manufactured everything going on with the Defaced Sisters. In the last part, we learned that the Defaced Sisters were actually, Fae and everything. Well, in this conversation, we learned that there was actually 8 of them, and that they had collectively raised a human that they named Armag, filled him with a bunch of stories about how he was the Armag of old reborn, and then sent him to the Numerian barbarians to lead. So Nerissa has orchestrated everything going on with the barbarians attacking Restov, as well as sending the Defaced Sisters with the barbarians to the area of Dunsword of the Stolen Plains to look for, or the Stolen Lands, to look for the Oculus of Abaddon. So Nerissa is behind all of that. However, she was not behind Vortikai waking up. So that brings us to our next part. The other part of this, as I mentioned, was Jamandi sent a request for aid in heading off the barbarian army headed towards Restov, which is the seat of the Aldori Swordlord's power in Brevoy. Now, this part is actually heavily tied in with Amiri's quest. So while doing Tristan's part first won't necessarily break Amiri's side quest, it becomes infinitely more difficult. And if you're playing on automatic, it's actually very likely to go ahead and break it still. Chapter 5 and the auto kingdom management mode do not play super well together. Suffice to say, the best option is honestly to go to Jamandi's side first and then go track Tristan down, because if you already know all of the information about what Nerissa is looking for outside of the game, then having that knowledge on your person, in your own head, basically gives you everything you would have gotten from going there first. So the best option is kind of really to go help Jamandi first. If you go there first, you'll actually be stopped by a group of barbarians, a small group, led by a man named Gwart, I believe it is, and he explains that a lot of the Tiger Lords think that Armag, resurrected apparently Armag, is not actually that great of a leader, and they would like him gone. So Amiri's side quest involves her, being a barbarian, sneaking into Armag's barbarian camp and basically saving her friend Nilak, which is part of her side quest, as well as challenging Armag to a one-on-one fight. She won't actually be able to kill him, but it is possible to win, which affects her side quest. But suffice to say, her saving Nilak is all that needs to happen for her side quest to continue, and we'll get into why that's important for all your companions later on, but I'm just kind of explaining that nuance. So once that is done, regardless of how it plays out, it will cut back to your group, speaking with Jamandi this time instead of being stopped by a guy named Gwart. If you arrived at the battlefield first, Jamandi will basically ask for your help on the battlefield. You will do exactly that. You'll help her fight the barbarians and the giants they seem to have aligned with somehow. And once you get to the camp, you find out that Armag, apparently learning the location of the tomb of the original Armag, essentially fled the battlefield with the Defaced Sisters and just left his army high and dry in the middle of this fight, thus making the Aldori Swordlords here the winners of this fight, which of course is helpful if you want to remain loyal to Jamandi. Let's say you do this part second. When you show up to the battlefield, if you've done the second, you still run into Gwart like normal. However, once you get to Jamandi, you learn that her army has just been absolutely decimated. Armag will still have fled after learning the location of the tomb of the original Armag. However, most of Jamandi's forces will have been lost. Now this is important because if you remember in previous parts of this series, we talked about the political situation in Brevoy, where the Aldori Swordlords and House Sertova were basically in a tense standoff, kind of a mutually assured destruction situation, with each of them trying to gain the upper hand on the other. Jamandi losing most of her forces to the barbarians essentially is handing House Sertova the win. But we will get into that in a little bit. Regardless of how this plays out when you arrive there, what you'll wind up doing is routing the barbarian forces that are left here in the Flintlock grasslands, which this is actually happening. And when you go to leave, you will confront both Natalia Sarycheva as well as Jamandi Eldori, the leader of both House Sarycheva and the Eldori Sword Lords. Now, this is a very fun part because, again, regardless of whether you showed up here first, they will decide that you've done so well here that they're deciding to not only grant you, your barony, but you'll essentially become king of this new realm of yours. So your barony will become a kingdom. Now, this is where showing up to the battlefield second actually doesn't end well, because you can choose basically where you want to sit within the political strife that I just mentioned. Now, if you showed up late, you basically absolutely cannot side with Jamandi, because she'll flat out refuse to side with you because you let her forces be destroyed. The evil option is to, in fact, side with House Sarycheva, which you can do without being evil, but it is decidedly the evilish option. Alternatively, as a required neutral choice, you can become a peacekeeper of sorts between the two nations, which is the best option for the long-term success of the country of Brevoy. Or, alternatively, you can essentially deny being allies with either of them and decide that you don't need their permission to become king and you just do it, which weirdly enough Natalia Sarycheva backs anyway, which is strange. Until you realize that the whole point of your barony existing was to give Jamandi allies, and if you're not giving Jamandi allies, then that also kind of helps House Sarycheva. But they will explain that in order to crown you king, you first need to deal with the Bloom, which you will have done with Tristan. That's all you got to do, is you just got to go track down Tristan and deal with that side quest. And then you also need to deal with Armag, because he fled the battlefield with the defaced sisters that were still alive, to the location of the tomb of Armag, which he had learned. Now, at this point, you will need to return to your capital, where you'll have a quick meeting with Lindsay about, where to find the tomb of Armag yourself. She will suggest some options, but essentially it comes down to two things. You can find some books in the little dungeon area where you find Tristan, which will open up a kingdom event, which will give you more information about where to find Armag's tomb. The second thing about this is that there is an event in a specific place in Glenabond, which is the region where Armag's tomb is, that you can run into. It's a text event. And if you complete this text event, it's like an old man in a boat or something. And once you've completed this text event, you have an increased chance to just naturally find Armag's tomb, which is exactly what doing the kingdom event does as well. It just greatly lowers the DC on the perception check on the map to find Armag's tomb. Doing either one of these lowers it enough to where you might actually be able to do it. Technically, it's possible to just find this tomb without doing either of these, but the perception check on the map is just insanely high. But basically what you want to do here is complete those events if necessary and pass the perception check to find Armag's tomb on the world map just a little southwest of the Flintlock grasslands, actually. So once we come to the tomb itself, we'll actually find a bunch of barbarians gathered out there. And if you speak to them, they're actually a bit conflicted, because most of them don't trust the defaced sisters. They're not sure how to feel about Armag fleeing a battle when he was trying to advance his armies on Restov. And then even if he was successful in fighting them off, he still just doesn't follow through with that at all. And there is a defaced sister guarding the tomb. Now, it is possible to pass a diplomacy check and get the barbarians to fight the defaced sister with you, but even if you kill her solo without their help, that no one really cares that the defaced sisters are gone. Most of the barbarians left don't trust them. Now, if Dugoth was still alive at the end of Chapter 4, when you dealt with his camp, then he will likely show up in the barbarian camp before we left the grasslands, but he will show up again in a more important role here in a little bit, which is why I mentioned this at this time. And then we want to make our way through Armag's tomb. Truthfully, kind of just a standard dungeon run. There's like a little trap gauntlet that was interesting, but for the most part, it's just a standard dungeon run. And at the end of it, you of course come to Armag. However, right before you get there, you'll actually meet a guy named Zorik, who was a cleric of Gorum, the barbarian god, who served the real Armag in life. And he has a bit of a test for you, basically to see if you're worthy of entering the tomb. You can pass a bunch of diplomacy checks and stuff to basically be allowed in and pass this guy, but even if you have to fight him, he's super weak, so I don't really understand what the challenge here was. But either way, once you deal with Zorik, you can go on to the next room here and speak to Armag, or at least attempt to speak to Armag. Here's the thing, finding this tomb is actually a little bit timed as well. So If you arrive at Armag's tomb and talk to him before a certain amount of time has passed, you'll get a different result than if that time has passed and then you find Armag's tomb. So essentially, what Armag was doing, as we're about to learn, in searching for this tomb, was he needed to reunite with the actual Armag, in his words. Essentially, the Defaced Sisters have told this guy his entire life that he was Armag, despite that obviously not actually being true. Armag was losing the battle to, go to Restov one way or the other. He realized he couldn't advance on Restov. He just didn't have the forces. So in realizing that, as well as learning the location of Armag's tomb, he decides that he needs to go there so he can reunite with his soul, as he likes to put it. Because on expressing this to the Defaced Sisters, apparently they just told him this. Now what this is actually doing is that when he picks up the ancient Armag's sword from this tomb, the actual Armag's soul is trapped in that sword. And upon picking that sword up, the current Armag had everything revealed to him by the old Armag. So, obviously very upset with this information, the current Armag murders the Defaced Sisters and everything, like we saw when we walked into the room, and then attacks you. So, the difference between getting here on time and getting here later is A, the difficulty of the fight, but B, if we wait too long, the soul of the actual Armag possesses the real, the current Armag, and thus he becomes unsavable. However, if you arrive here on time, the fight is a little easier, as well as giving you the opportunity to spare the current Armag, who has for his entire life been lied to and used by Nerissa and her Defaced Sisters. So it is very possible, if you arrived here on time, to spare Armag and, give him the chance at a life he, never got up to this point, which I think is probably the nicest ending for Armag himself, but you can also choose to kill him as well and put the poor guy out of his misery. But either way, we will have solved the crisis and put an end to the threat of the Numerian barbarians to your kingdom, as well as the kingdom of Brevoy. Now, upon exiting the tomb, we will be confronted by the Tiger Lords. Now, this conversation can go a few different ways depending on, is Armag alive, for starters. But there will be a lot of conflict about whether or not to split the tribe into two people. Some people, especially if Armags are alive, definitely wants to, keep him as chieftain, whereas some people don't because he fled a battlefield. If Dugoth is alive, he'll have some things to say about it. Gwart has some things to say about it. If Amiri's with you, she can have some things to say about it. This is a very complex conversation, but ultimately, it all results in the same endings. You can offer some of the Tiger Lords a place in your kingdom. You can basically tell all of them to get the hell out and go back to Numeria, or you can involve yourself and kind of, give them advice on who should be chieftain, whether that's Armag, Dugoth, or Gwart. But regardless of your choices here, once we're done, we can head back to our capital, where we will be crowned as king of our brand new full-blown kingdom, as opposed to just a barony. And that pretty much wraps up part 5, guys. So we won't get into part 6 and chapter 6 until after the ancient curse has blown through part 4, if you were still on that timer, because like I said, the Twiceborn Warlord chapter begins immediately after Varnhold vanishing, so it's very possible to complete Twiceborn Warlord while you're still on Ancient Curse Part 4. So you'll still have to run through all of that timer, as well as the Part 5 timer, until you get to Chapter 6, which can leave you quite a very long chunk of time to focus exclusively on kingdom management, which is very helpful. I do want to mention before we wrap this up, the ending of Chapter 4 and how you deal with Tristan and Vorticai, as well as Chapter 5 here, has just a ton of decisions that greatly impact the ending of the game. A lot of the decisions about ending slides and stuff gets decided right here. But we will talk more about that at the appropriate time. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support everyone's been giving the channel. So I truly appreciate absolutely anybody who watches this stuff, especially if you made it this far. Regardless, thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.